Moving to item 28.4, the zoning bylaw amendment for part of 2555 Marchurst Road and part of 2625 Marchurst Road. We have a motion, and Councillor Kelly, you have a motion as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Whereas the Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee heard from a number of delegations at its meeting of December 1st, 2025, and several concerns pertaining to the proposed use of the land to permit a battery energy storage system were brought to the committee's attention. And whereas Council may vote to approve the zoning bylaw amendment to permit the BESS despite the recommendation for refusal by Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee, and whereas the necessary plans and reports for site plan control are preliminary, contain multiple errors and or are incomplete, and whereas such a project should proceed with caution given the potential implications to the neighboring property owners, and whereas a holding provision could ensure that all plans and reports related to site plan control are completed and approved to the city's satisfaction prior to the zoning for a BESS being in full force and effect. Therefore, be it resolved, a holding symbol be added to the zoning bylaw 2008-250 for part of 2555 Marchurst Road and part of 2625 Marchurst Road for a battery energy storage system until an emergency response plan, noise study, and environmental impact statement have been received, which meet the requirement for the city as part of the site plan control application. Be it further resolved that pursuant to the Planning Act subsection 3417, no further notice be given. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I do have a few questions for staff.
Sure,
and as we discussed yesterday, I don't know if other colleagues are going to have questions, but I would have some wrap-up comments as well. So I guess my first question for staff, just to confirm, so Council has the authority under the Planning Act and the city zoning practice to apply a holding symbol when information needed to support zoning is incomplete. Is that correct?
Yes, we have that ability.
Okay. And a holding symbol is a standard tool used for a use that may be acceptable in principle, but council needs certain studies or conditions satisfied before the zoning takes full effect. Would that be correct?
Typically, it's used in a context where there's something outside of the planning process that needs to be in place in order for something to proceed. So, for example, you don't have the infrastructure in place to connect the project, and therefore need to hold until that can be resolved, or some legal matter needs to be resolved. But it's usually something else needs to be done prior to being able to exercise the authority of zoning.
Thank you. But if council did want to ensure that zoning conforms to the official plan requirement that zoning be based on those reviewed studies, is a holding the mechanism that allows approval in principle while preventing development until those studies are finalized? Would that be the tool that we would have?
Through the chair, yes. I mean, as written, this is something we could implement. Those studies are already in our possession, and part of the normal site plan process would be to review them, ensure they meet our standards and requirements, and are, regardless of which way council chooses to vote on these two motions, I would say that it is our normal expectation and practice that we would make sure that those studies are done to the satisfaction of the city before site plan approval is issued by staff. That is a delegated decision for staff.
Okay. And is there precedent? Has Ottawa City Council used a holding symbol before at zoning, past zoning, but put a holding symbol on it?
Yes, we have. There's it's been used in, as I said, it's unusual to be tied to things coming through site plan, but the idea of an H on zoning is something that is used.
And is there any precedent for a battery energy storage system zoning being approved with an H?
I do not. I'm going to ask our Director of Planning to come up here.
Thank you.
Yes, Chair. The zoning bylaw amendment for the attached or affiliated with the Trail Road BESS or the William McEwen Drive BESS placed a holding provision on an affiliated piece of property that was owned by the city, where there was a lease that had to be entered into before the H would be lifted. And
understanding that may be more tied to the Planning Act than what I'm talking about, I certainly would think that, or I would make the argument that the lack of a lease with the city is certainly less important than the safety of my residents and the safety of their well water and what would happen if there was an incident. That's all the questions I have for staff now. I see that my colleague, Catherine Kitts, and I want to thank her for seconding this motion. She supported this project at council and again at ARAC. And so I wanted to make a point of acknowledging and reinforcing the fact that you can support this and support BESS. You would be supporting the zoning for BESS with a holding symbol. Thank you.
I understand the concerns you've raised, Councillor Kelly, and I'll let you wrap up on this.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And I'll address your point first. And this is the first time I've ever brought a motion to bring out a holding symbol on everything. So on anything. So I would never. I understand your point. We could make this argument at every development, but not every development is a 250 megawatt, 256 container industrial scale battery energy storage system in rural Ottawa. So often this debate is contentious, and sadly most opposition to this project was framed as NIMBYism or that it was based on misinformation and irrational fears. That is not true, and it is not a fair characterization of my community's concerns. This is not and never has been a debate on whether battery energy storage is a useful technology. I have supported the battery energy storage systems where the locations and land use fit was right and where the public had a fair chance to review a complete, credible proposal. I did so just at the last ARAC meeting. Today, we're voting on something more important. Whether or not this specific zoning bylaw amendment for Marchurst Road meets the city's planning rules, protects rural Ottawa, and reflects a fair process for the people who will have to live beside it. I will ask you all to vote against this amendment, and here is why. First, the zoning request, in my opinion, is premature under our own official plan. The official plan contains a specific policy for private principal battery energy storage facilities. It says zoning provisions must be established based on a review of key evidence, noise control, an environmental impact study, fire protection and emergency response plans satisfactory to Ottawa Fire Services, and a commissioning and decommissioning plan. OFS has yet to sign off on that plan. Staff acknowledge in the report that those core documents are not complete and will be updated and finalized later through site plan. Zoning, particularly in this case, for something so different, needs to be based on final reviewed evidence, not on promises that evidence will come later. Once we pass this zoning, council loses all of its leverage. Site plan control is delegated and does not return to committee or council. So if we zone today, while the mandatory studies are unfinished, we are giving away our strongest land use control. This is not sound rural planning. The public consultation process has been inadequate for a proposal of this scale. Residents have raised again and again that key documents were missing or posted late, and staff have confirmed that important materials were added after circulation began. Consultation is not a box to tick, and it's not about minimum timelines. It's about whether people had a real opportunity to examine the full technical case before decisions are locked in. And this is a massive file, and they did not have that opportunity. The provincial procurement and site selection process that brought us here was unfair to rural Ottawa. The IESO procurement created a narrow delivery requirement along transmission corridors, and proponents then searched quickly for rural parcels of land in that corridor. This is backwards planning. It puts speed and commercial deliverability ahead of land use fit, rural character, and local consent. I've said this from the very beginning, but this is not how major industrial infrastructure should be landed in a rural community. When residents were looking for answers, I hosted an open information session, invited the IESO to attend. They refused. So the very body that drove the commercial logic and the location pressure behind this project did not show up to face the community when it was requested and required. Opposition here is broad, credible, and rooted in land use protection. This is not one or two neighbors. The local chapter of the Ontario Federation of Agricultural is opposed because this proposal industrializes a working rural landscape and sets a precedent that rural lands are the path of least resistance for provincial energy procurement. The Friends of the Carp Hills also opposed. That's our leading rural agricultural organization and a long-standing natural heritage stewardship group that are aligned in opposition. Finally, this is the wrong place for an industrial scale facility. Rural countryside is not a default industrial catch basin just because its use is light on jobs. It is protected rural landscape. The burden is on the applicant to prove compatibility with final evidence, and that evidence is not before us. For all of those reasons, I will be voting no on the zoning bylaw amendment. But I also recognize that some of my colleagues may choose to approve despite ARAC's recommendation and despite the incomplete record. If council is going to pass the zoning bylaw amendment anyway, then at a minimum, it must be subject to a holding symbol, a motion that I have moved today. The holding provision ensures zoning cannot take effect until the mandatory safety and environmental studies are final, accepted, and proven through site plan control. That is the least due diligence we owe our rural residents and the least amount of protection that this council should insist on before any construction is allowed to proceed. This is not a residential tower. We are not talking about where the garbage or the bike rack goes, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much.